The debris was still glowing when I gave the order to cease fire, and I remember feeling nothing but the clean, sharp satisfaction of a job done well. 11 minutes. That was all it took. 11 minutes from the first salvo to the final structural collapse of the human station designated Caldera, and now its wreckage tumbled through the void in a slow, silent cascade of twisted metal and frozen atmosphere. I am Commander Vaishon Cole of the Drethani Sovereignty, and on that day, I believed I had won something that mattered. My bridge crew erupted in celebration around me. Torith, my senior sensor officer, slammed his fist against his console and let out a roar that shook the overhead lighting. Dranik, my executive officer, gripped my shoulder hard enough to bruise and told me I had just earned my place in the Sovereignty's war histories. Even the junior navigation staff were shouting, their voices overlapping in a wall of noise that filled the command deck. I let them celebrate. They had earned it. We had been deployed to the Mirith corridor 6 months earlier with a simple mandate from High Command. This stretch of unclaimed space, rich with mineral deposits and jump lane intersections, belonged to the Drethani Sovereignty. Anything built here by another species was an intrusion. Anything flying another flag was a target. The humans had planted their little station in the densest part of the corridor's asteroid belt, Outpost Caldera, a mining and research facility housing roughly 340 civilians and a skeleton defense crew. It had light shielding, a handful of point defense turrets, and exactly 0 capital-class weapons. When my strike group of 8 cruisers dropped out of faster-than-light transit and locked weapons, the outcome was never in question. I will give the humans credit for one thing. Their evacuation protocols were fast. Within the first 3 minutes of engagement, Caldera had launched its emergency shuttles. Most of them made it out before the station's reactor containment failed. I tracked them on sensors as they scattered into the asteroid belt, small and desperate, and beneath my concern. My orders were to destroy the outpost, not to hunt down lifeboats. I am a soldier, not a butcher, and the distinction mattered to me then. It does not matter to me now, not because I have become cruel, but because everything I believed about that day turned out to be wrong. The shuttles fled. The station died. My strike group held position long enough to confirm total structural failure, and then we turned for home. The journey back to Sovereignty space took 4 days at standard transit speed, and by the time we arrived, the news had already spread. The destruction of Caldera was being broadcast on every military and civilian channel across 6 systems. High Command had turned our 11-minute operation into a propaganda event of staggering proportion. My face appeared on recruitment screens. My name was mentioned in speeches by senior officials I had never met. Sovereign Malthrin himself, the supreme military authority of our civilization, referenced the operation as proof that the Drethani expansion into the Mirith corridor would proceed without meaningful resistance. I was promoted to senior commander. Medals were issued to every officer in the strike group. Dranik received a commendation for tactical excellence, which he wore on his uniform with visible pride for weeks afterward. The celebration was not limited to the military. Civilian networks ran analysis segments explaining why the destruction of Caldera represented a turning point in galactic territorial politics. Commentators who had never served a day in uniform dissected our attack patterns and praised our efficiency. Artists produced commemorative imagery of my cruiser silhouetted against Caldera's burning hull. Children in sovereignty schools were taught about the operation as an example of decisive action against a complacent adversary. The humans, according to our intelligence analysts, were soft. They had spread too far, too fast, building fragile outposts across contested space, without the military infrastructure to defend them. They had assumed that their reputation alone would keep aggressors at bay, and we had proven that assumption fatally wrong. I accepted all of this. I believed every word. Then the silence began. In the days immediately following the destruction of Caldera, our intelligence division monitored every human communication frequency we could access. We intercepted the outpost distress burst, which had been transmitted automatically during the attack, a compressed data package containing personnel records, sensor logs, and a final status report. We expected a response. A diplomatic protest, at minimum. A formal declaration of hostilities, more likely. Possibly the deployment of a punitive fleet from the nearest human marshalling point, which our analysts estimated would take 3 to 4 weeks to arrive. Nothing came. 1 week passed. Then 2. Then a full month. The human communication channels we monitored carried routine traffic. Supply manifests, personnel transfers, scientific data exchanges, commercial shipping schedules. Nothing about Caldera. Nothing about the Mirith corridor. Nothing about the Drathani sovereignty at all. Our intelligence division interpreted this as confirmation of their initial assessment. The humans were cutting their losses. Caldera had been a minor installation, not worth the cost of a military response. They were absorbing the loss and moving on, exactly as a soft, overextended civilization would be expected to do. I was assigned to garrison the Mirith corridor, with a defensive flotilla of 12 cruisers, stationed near the ruins of Caldera itself. High Command wanted a permanent military presence to establish our territorial claim, and I was the natural choice to lead it. I had destroyed the outpost. Now I would guard the space it had occupied. I took the assignment without complaint, but something bothered me. It sat in the back of my mind like a stone caught in machinery, small but persistent. The silence was too complete. I had studied human behavior patterns during my training, and this did not match. Humans were not a species that quietly accepted losses. Their history was defined by escalation. When attacked, they did not retreat. They reorganized and came back with more. I kept this concern to myself. Expressing doubt about High Command's assessment would have been career suicide, and I had just been promoted. So I watched. I waited. I ran additional sensor sweeps at ranges far beyond standard protocol. My crew thought I was being thorough. I was being afraid, though I would not have admitted it then. 43 days after the destruction of Outpost Caldera, Torith flagged an anomaly on the long-range sensor grid. It was a single contact, entering the system from the far edge of the Mirith corridor. The signature was massive, far larger than any warship in our database. Torith initially logged it as a sensor malfunction. When recalibration confirmed the reading, he reclassified it as a rogue asteroid drifting through the jump lane transit corridor. When spectral analysis returned energy signatures consistent with active reactor output, he went quiet. I walked to his station and looked at the display myself. The contact was moving at a steady approach velocity, not the erratic drift of natural debris. Its energy profile was enormous, radiating heat and electromagnetic noise across a dozen frequency bands. And it was alone, or nearly so. 4 smaller contacts flanked it in a loose formation, their signatures consistent with light escort vessels. I asked Torith for a size estimate. He worked the numbers twice before answering. 6 kilometers along its primary axis, 3 kilometers wide. Mass readings were still resolving, but preliminary calculations suggested something in the range of a small moon. I felt the stone in my mind grow heavier. I ordered the flotilla to battle stations and transmitted an alert to High Command. Then I stood on my bridge, watching that impossible signature grow brighter on my tactical display, and I waited for the humans to show me what they had sent, in place of a warning. 36 hours after the initial detection, the object entered visual range, and I understood why my tactical database had no classification for it. It was not a warship, it was not a station. It was something that existed in a category I had never considered, something my military training had no framework for, because the Drathani sovereignty had never imagined that such a thing could be used as a weapon. It was a shipyard. The humans called it a Forge-class mobile shipyard, and its designation, transmitted in a single automated identification burst, was Prometheus Anvil. 6 kilometers of industrial architecture, bristling with smelting arrays and fabrication gantries, and automated assembly lines that ran the full length of its spine. It looked less like a vessel and more like a city that someone had torn from a planet's surface and hurled into space, trailing umbilical cables and cargo cranes like roots ripped from soil. 4 human frigates escorted it. 4, against my 12 cruisers. The disparity was so extreme that it felt like a deliberate provocation. I hailed the shipyard on standard communication frequencies. My message was direct and unambiguous. This system was claimed by the Drathani sovereignty. All human assets were to withdraw immediately or face military action. I transmitted my credentials, my authorization codes, and a reference to the diplomatic precedent established by our destruction of Outpost Caldera. The response came 11 minutes later, not from a person, from an automated system. A single text transmission in flat, unaccented galactic common. Industrial reclamation operation commencing. Construction timetable active. Do not interfere with assembly operations. Nothing else. No negotiation, no acknowledgement of my authority, no threat. Just a flat statement of intent, delivered with the same emotional weight as a shipping label. I transmitted again. I demanded to speak with the commanding officer. I demanded an explanation for the presence of a human industrial platform in sovereignty-claimed space. I demanded a response that came from a living being rather than a machine. Silence. The Prometheus anvil continued its approach, as though my flotilla did not exist. It moved with the slow, inevitable momentum of something that had no reason to hurry, because nothing in its path had the power to stop it. It entered the system's primary asteroid belt and began positioning itself among the densest mineral concentrations, rotating its massive frame with bursts from attitude thrusters the size of my cruiser's main engines. Then the mining drones launched. They poured from bays along the anvil's flanks in streams of hundreds, small automated units with cutting lasers and grappling arms that descended on the surrounding asteroids like insects on fallen fruit. Within hours, the first ore shipments were traveling back to the shipyard along cargo tethers, rivers of raw material flowing into the anvil's intake processors. I contacted High Command again. My report was urgent. I described the shipyard's dimensions, its industrial capacity, the speed at which it was establishing operations. I requested reinforcements. I requested authorization to engage. The response took 8 hours to arrive. High Command acknowledged my report but did not share my alarm. Their assessment was that the humans were rebuilding their mining outpost using a mobile construction platform, a wasteful and inefficient approach that demonstrated desperation rather than strength. I was ordered to monitor the situation, but not to engage. If the humans wanted to invest enormous resources in rebuilding a facility we could simply destroy again, that was their mistake to make. I read the orders twice. Then I looked at my tactical display, where the Prometheus anvil was consuming asteroids at a rate that turned my stomach, and I knew with absolute certainty that High Command was wrong. No civilization deploys a 6-kilometer industrial platform to rebuild a mining outpost. The energy expenditure alone was orders of magnitude beyond what a simple station would require. The mining operation was too aggressive, too fast, harvesting materials at volumes that exceeded any reasonable construction need. I pulled up every intelligence file we had on human shipyard doctrine. The records were thin, mostly fragmentary intercepts and second-hand accounts from species that had observed human industrial operations at a distance. Almost everything was classified at levels I could not access, but what I found was enough to make me understand the shape of what was happening, even if I could not yet see its full scale. The 4 escort frigates moved through the asteroid belt in patrol patterns that covered every approach vector to the shipyard. They did not posture. They did not make aggressive maneuvers. They flew with the mechanical precision of automated systems following a locked program, and every route they traveled was optimized for sensor coverage and defensive response time. They were not guarding the shipyard because it was vulnerable. They were guarding it the way you guard a loaded weapon while it charges. I spent the next 48 hours watching the anvil work. I slept in my command chair. I ate at my station. I tracked every drone, every ore shipment, every energy fluctuation from the shipyard's massive frame. And on the 3rd day, Toreth called me to his console, with a voice that had gone flat and careful. The fabrication arrays deep inside the anvil were running at full capacity. Energy signatures consistent with hull plating synthesis and reactor core assembly were radiating from its construction bays. The spectral analysis was unmistakable. The shipyard was not rebuilding the outpost. It was building warships. I stared at the data until the numbers burned into my vision. Then I calculated the production rate based on energy consumption and material intake. Then I calculated the timeline. The math was simple. The implications made my hands go cold. At current production rates, the Prometheus anvil would complete its first warship within 5 days of arrival. A second would follow within 3 days after that, as the supply chain matured and fabrication processes optimized. By the end of the month, the output would be limited only by raw material availability, and the asteroid belt contained enough material to build a fleet that would dwarf anything in the Myreth corridor. I sent an emergency transmission to High Command, Priority 1, all encryption protocols active. I told them what the shipyard was building. I told them the production timeline. I recommended an immediate full-scale assault before the first ship launched. The response came faster this time. High Command authorized a probing attack using my flotilla's full strength, but their language was still dismissive. They expected me to destroy the shipyard with the same ease we had destroyed Caldera. They still believed this was a problem that could be solved with 8 cruisers and 11 minutes. I assembled my captains for a tactical briefing and laid out the attack plan. We would approach in a wide formation, using the asteroid belt as cover, and converge on the anvil from multiple vectors to divide its defensive fire. The 4 escort frigates were our primary concern. Once they were neutralized, the shipyard itself would be an easy target. That was the theory. We launched the attack at local dawn, an arbitrary designation based on our fleet's internal chronometer. 8 cruisers in a staggered approach, engines at full military power, weapons charged and targeting systems locked. The human frigates responded before we cleared the outer asteroid perimeter. They did not scatter or fall back or attempt to buy time. They advanced directly into our formation with a coordinated aggression that I had never seen from vessels of their class. Their movements were synchronized to a degree that suggested either perfect crew coordination or automated combat protocols operating at machine speed. They rotated shield facings in unison, presenting fresh armor to our fire, while their weapons struck from angles we had not anticipated. They used the asteroids themselves as tactical assets, weaving between rock formations that their patrol routes had already mapped to the centimeter. Every time we adjusted our approach, they had already repositioned to counter it. Then the anvil itself opened fire. Concealed weapons batteries along the shipyard's hull, hidden behind what we had assumed were cargo panels and maintenance hatches, activated in a rippling sequence that turned the anvil's 6-kilometer frame into a fortress. The firepower was not overwhelming in the way a battleship's guns would be. It was precise, targeted. Each shot aimed at engine clusters and sensor arrays and weapons mounts with a surgical accuracy that spoke of targeting systems far more advanced than anything we had expected from an industrial platform. 2 of my cruisers died in the first 90 seconds. Their shields failed under concentrated fire from batteries they had not known existed, and their hulls came apart in bursts of atmosphere and shrapnel that scattered across the asteroid belt. I ordered a tactical withdrawal to regroup, pulling my remaining ships behind a dense cluster of asteroids large enough to block the anvil's line of fire. We had lost 2 ships and damaged a third. The 4 human frigates had taken hits, but remained combat effective, their shield systems cycling with a resilience that defied their class rating. Before I could issue new orders, the anvil's primary fabrication bay doors opened. The first ship emerged stern first, its hull still radiating the dull red heat of recent forging. A destroyer-class vessel, built entirely from local asteroid material, assembled from raw ore to finished warship in under 5 days. Its running lights activated as it cleared the bay, its weapons powered up, its engines fired, pushing it into a defensive position alongside the frigates without a single verbal command that my communication intercepts could detect. I watched a ship that had not existed a week ago take its place in a battle line and prepare to fight. Something broke inside my understanding of the war we were fighting. Not my courage, my framework. The mental architecture that told me how conflicts between civilizations were supposed to work. You build ships at home, in orbital yards above fortified worlds, over months and years of careful construction. You deploy those ships in fleets. You fight battles. You count your losses and your enemy's losses, and you determine who is winning, based on the mathematics of attrition. The humans had just changed the mathematics. We attacked again. We had no choice. Retreat without engagement would end my career and accomplish nothing. My 6 remaining cruisers drove hard at the defensive line, targeting the newborn destroyer as the weakest link. It was not weak. It fought with the same inhuman coordination as the frigates, slotting into their formation as though it had trained with them for years rather than minutes. And while we fought, while my ships traded fire with 5 human vessels in the asteroid belt's killing ground, the anvil kept working. I could see the fabrication energy signatures on my tactical display, steady and relentless, the heartbeat of a machine that did not care about the battle raging around it. We lost another cruiser. Then a fourth was crippled, its engines shattered by a torpedo spread from 2 frigates that had flanked us while the destroyer held our attention. I ordered a full retreat. As my surviving ships pulled back to the system's edge, trailing damage and burning atmosphere, I counted the forces arrayed against us. 5 combat vessels now, and on my long-range sensors, the Anvil's second fabrication bay was cycling up to full power. I transmitted my after-action report to High Command, with a recommendation that I knew would sound desperate. I told them the truth, as plainly as I could articulate it. The humans had not sent a fleet to avenge Caldera. A fleet was a finite asset. It could be counted. It could be matched. It could be destroyed. Instead, they had sent the machine that builds fleets, and the raw materials surrounding it were practically limitless. Every asteroid in the belt was a warship waiting to be born. We had not destroyed a human outpost. We had cleared the ground for something worse. In the days that followed, I watched from the system's edge as the Prometheus Anvil accelerated its production cycle. A second destroyer launched 31 hours after the first. A third followed 26 hours after that. The intervals were shrinking. Each ship that launched freed up fabrication capacity for the next, and the mining drones had expanded their operations to a second asteroid cluster, feeding an ever-growing river of ore into the Anvil's intake processors. My remaining ships were in no condition for another engagement. 2 needed reactor repairs. 1 had lost its primary sensor array entirely. I requested reinforcements, but High Command was only now beginning to take my reports seriously, and mobilizing a sector-level response fleet would take weeks. I did the only thing I could. I watched. By the end of the first week after our failed attack, the human fleet in the Mirith corridor had grown from 4 frigates to 7 warships of varying classes. Destroyers, mostly. But I also identified what appeared to be a light cruiser under construction, its skeletal frame visible through the Anvil's open fabrication bays. Automated defense platforms began appearing among the asteroids. Weapons batteries anchored to rock, sensor buoys, broadcasting on frequencies that blanketed the entire system. Orbital mines deployed in patterns that turned the approaches to the shipyard into a labyrinth of overlapping kill zones. And then, on the 9th day, Torith showed me something that drained the last remnant of hope from my chest. Structural scans of the Prometheus Anvil revealed new construction along its port flank. Not warships, not weapons platforms. New fabrication modules. The shipyard was building additions to itself, expanding its own production capacity, growing like a living thing that fed on the system's resources and converted them into more of itself. What had arrived as one platform was becoming a complex, and the complex was becoming an ecosystem. I drafted a personal message to Sovereign Malthran, bypassing the standard chain of command. I described what I was witnessing in terms I hoped would penetrate the political insulation that surrounded our supreme leader. I told him that the Drethani sovereignty had made a catastrophic miscalculation. We had measured human strength by the size of the outpost we destroyed, and concluded they were weak. We had never considered that the outpost was not the expression of their strength. The Prometheus Anvil was the expression of their strength, and it was still growing. The sovereignty's response arrived 3 days later, and for the first time since the destruction of Caldera, it carried the weight of genuine alarm. High Command was assembling the entire Mirith sector fleet, 31 capital ships and their escort elements. Every warship within 3 systems was being recalled and redirected to the corridor. It was the largest mobilization in sovereignty history outside of a formal declaration of war. The fleet would arrive in 11 days. I did the math on production rates and felt something I had never experienced while looking at a strategic projection. I felt despair. In 11 days, at current and accelerating production rates, the Prometheus Anvil would add another 12 warships to its growing fleet. The defense network would expand. The second fabrication module would come online, doubling output capacity. By the time our armada arrived, we would not be attacking a shipyard defended by a handful of frigates. We would be attacking a fortress defended by a fleet that had been purpose-built to destroy us. I transmitted this assessment to High Command. I recommended accelerating the mobilization timeline by any means necessary. I recommended deploying long-range strike assets to harass the Anvil's mining operations and slow its production. High Command acknowledged my recommendations and implemented none of them. The fleet would arrive when it arrived. I was ordered to maintain observation and avoid further engagement. So I watched. I counted each new hull as it emerged from the anvil's bays. I tracked the expansion of the mining network. I monitored the defense platforms as they multiplied through the asteroid belt, and I began to understand something that my training and my culture and my entire civilization had failed to prepare me for. We had started a war with a species that did not fight wars the way we understood them. The Drethani way of war was built on the concept of decisive battle. You marshaled your forces, engaged the enemy, and the outcome of that engagement determined the outcome of the conflict. Victory went to the side with superior firepower, superior numbers, superior tactics. The humans were not playing that game. They had not sent a fleet to match against ours. They had sent the capacity to build an unlimited number of fleets, powered by resources that we could not cut off, because they were the system itself. They had turned the battlefield into a factory, and the factory into a weapon. I counted 19 warships on the day the Sovereignty fleet arrived. The Prometheus anvil had produced 15 combat vessels in 23 days. The second fabrication module was nearly complete. Defense platforms numbered in the dozens. Sensor coverage extended across the entire system. 3 weeks earlier, there had been nothing here but the cooling debris of a dead outpost. 31 Drethani capital ships dropped out of faster-than-light transit at the edge of the Mirith corridor. I watched them arrive from my position on the system's periphery, and I felt something I had never felt while looking at my own armada. Doubt. Not in the courage of our crews or the quality of our ships. Doubt in the fundamental premise of what we were about to attempt. 31 ships was an overwhelming force by any conventional measure. It was more firepower than the Sovereignty had committed to a single engagement in over a decade. But conventional measures had stopped applying the moment the Prometheus anvil entered this system. Admiral Gorvash commanded the fleet from the dreadnought Ironfang, the largest warship in the Sovereignty's inventory. He was a veteran of 14 campaigns, a strategist of genuine skill, and he reviewed my intelligence reports with the careful attention they deserved. But I could see in his eyes the same disbelief I had felt when the anvil first appeared on my sensors. The scale of what the humans had built in 3 weeks defied his experience. The attack plan was sound. 3 assault groups would converge on the shipyard from different vectors, forcing the human fleet to divide its defensive coverage. A 4th group would target the mining drone network, cutting the anvil's supply chain. My surviving ships would provide sensor support and electronic warfare from the periphery. We launched the assault at the 24th hour after the fleet's arrival. 31 warships against 19 human vessels and a constellation of defense platforms. The battle that followed was the largest engagement in the Mirith corridor's history, and it began with a violence that shook my ship's hull even from our position at the edge of the combat zone. The first assault group struck the human perimeter and met a wall of coordinated fire that staggered their formation within seconds. Every human ship moved as part of a single integrated combat network, sharing targeting data and defensive coverage with a fluidity that made 19 vessels fight like one organism with 19 weapons. They did not waste shots. They did not overlap fire on the same target. Every salvo struck a different ship, spreading damage across our formation and preventing us from concentrating our own fire in response. Admiral Gorvash adjusted. The second and third assault groups hit the flanks simultaneously, driving wedges into the human formation and isolating clusters of ships for focused engagement. Drethani firepower began to tell. A human destroyer took a reactor hit and broke apart. 2 defense platforms were overwhelmed and destroyed. The human line bent. It did not break. The frigates that had been present since the anvil's arrival fought with a ferocity that bordered on recklessness, throwing themselves into the gaps in our formation and delivering torpedo salvos at point-blank range. One frigate traded its own destruction for a crippling hit on a Drethani cruiser 3 times its size, driving its burning hull into the cruiser's engine section and taking them both out of the fight. I tracked the battle from my sensor post, feeding tactical data to Admiral Gorvash and watching the numbers shift. We were winning. Slowly, expensively, but winning. 7 human warships destroyed against 5 of ours. The human fleet was being pushed back toward the anvil. Then the anvil's main fabrication bay doors opened, and a new destroyer slid out into the void. It was still hot. Its hull plating had not finished cooling from the forge. Residual fabrication energy crackled along its spine like static discharge, and its weapons were already powered, locking onto the nearest Drathani ship before its assembly clamps had fully released. The battle was still raging, and the factory was still producing. 20 minutes later, a second ship launched. A frigate this time, small and fast, and immediately integrated into the human combat network. It joined the defensive line as though it had always been there, filling a gap left by a destroyed vessel and resuming fire without a moment's hesitation. Admiral Gorvash saw the same thing I did. He understood the implication. He pushed the assault harder, driving his remaining ships toward the anvil itself, trying to destroy the source before it could tip the balance. 3 Drathani cruisers broke through the human line and made a direct run at the shipyard. The anvil's concealed batteries fired. The same weapons that had savaged my flotilla weeks earlier tore into the assault group with concentrated precision. One cruiser lost its shield generators and tumbled away, trailing atmosphere. A second took a direct hit to its command deck and went dark. The third made it close enough to launch a full torpedo spread that struck the anvil's port fabrication module. The torpedoes hit. They did damage. A section of the shipyard's hull buckled and vented, and fabrication energy readings in the damaged module dropped to 0. But the anvil had 4 fabrication modules now, and the other 3 never stopped working. My flagship, the cruiser Ashenmaw, took a hit from a human destroyer that I never saw coming. The ship shuddered, alarms screaming, and then the port bulkhead collapsed inward, and everything became noise and heat and darkness. I regained consciousness in an escape pod. The automated ejection system had fired when the command deck's structural integrity failed. Through the pod's narrow viewport, I watched the Ashenmaw break apart, its spine cracking open like a split bone, spilling debris and atmosphere into the void. The battle continued around me. Drathani ships were dying, human ships were dying, and the anvil kept building. My pod's emergency beacon activated automatically, broadcasting on a standard distress frequency. I expected to drift until a sovereignty vessel recovered me, or until my oxygen ran out, whichever came first. A human destroyer picked me up instead. The recovery was efficient and impersonal. A shuttle collected my pod, brought it aboard, and a human crew extracted me with careful, practiced movements that suggested they had done this many times before. I expected interrogation. I prepared myself for whatever methods humans use to extract intelligence from captured officers. They gave me medical treatment. A woman in a gray uniform examined the cuts on my face, the bruise across my ribs where a support beam had struck me during the hull breach, and a hairline fracture in my left forearm that I had not even noticed. She worked without speaking, her hands steady and precise. And when she finished, she led me to a small cabin with a bunk, a light, a water dispenser, and a viewport. Not a cell. A cabin. I sat on the bunk and stared at the viewport and tried to understand what was happening. Through the transparent panel, I could see the aftermath of the battle. The Drathani fleet was shattered. I counted the wreckage of 14 sovereignty warships drifting in the asteroid belt, their hulls broken and dark. 9 more appeared to be under tow, captured by human vessels that had disabled rather than destroyed them. The remaining Drathani ships were gone, fled back toward sovereignty space at maximum speed. The human fleet had taken losses. 7 of their vessels were destroyed, their debris mingling with ours in the expanding field of wreckage. But as I watched, salvage drones emerged from the anvil and descended on the battlefield. They did not distinguish between human and Drathani wreckage. They collected everything: metal, components, hull plating, the shattered remains of ships that had fought and died on both sides, gathered up and fed back to the anvil's intake processors. The Drathani ships we had destroyed were becoming raw material for the next generation of human ships. I sat in that cabin for 6 hours before anyone came to speak with me. I spent the time watching the salvage operation and running calculations in my head. The math was obscene. The anvil had entered the system with enough raw material to begin production. Now it had the debris of 40 warships to process, in addition to the asteroid belt's mineral wealth. Production rates would accelerate. Output would increase. The fleet would grow faster now than at any point since the anvil's arrival. We had fed the machine with our own dead, The door opened, and a human officer entered. She was tall, lean, with short dark hair and eyes that carried the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from sustained combat command. She wore the rank insignia of a lieutenant commander, and she introduced herself as Sophie Grant, liaison officer for prisoner coordination. She sat in the cabin's only chair and looked at me with an expression I did not expect. Not hostility, not triumph, something closer to professional curiosity. She asked if my injuries had been properly treated. I told her they had. She asked if I needed anything. I told her I needed to understand what was happening. She considered this for a moment, then spoke in a calm, measured tone that suggested she was repeating something she had been authorized to say. The Prometheus Anvil was a Forge-class mobile shipyard, one of several maintained by Earth's Frontier Industrial Command. Its deployment to the Mirith Corridor was initiated 41 hours after the destruction of Outpost Caldera. Its mission was not retaliation. Its mission was establishment. I asked her to explain the difference. She leaned forward slightly. You destroyed a place where 300 people lived. Earth decided this was a good location for 30,000. The words landed with a weight that pressed the air from my lungs. I asked why they had not simply sent a fleet to punish us. A punitive strike, a show of force, something that fit the pattern of how wars between civilizations were supposed to be conducted. Sophie Grant looked at me as though the answer should have been obvious. Fleets leave, she said. Shipyards stay. She let the silence hold for a moment, then stood and told me that I would be transferred to a diplomatic holding facility once the area was secure. My status was prisoner of war, but the humans intended to use me as a communication channel with the Drathani sovereignty once negotiations began. I asked what negotiations. She paused at the door and looked back at me. The ones where your government agrees to leave the Mirith Corridor permanently. It should not take long. Your leadership will understand the situation once they see what we have built here. She left. I turned back to the viewport. The second fabrication module, the one the Anvil had been constructing since before the battle, came online while I watched. Its assembly bays lit up with the blue-white glow of activated forges, and within hours, it launched its first completed hull. Not a warship. A habitat ring, a circular residential structure designed to support permanent human settlement. Transport ships began arriving the next day. Not military vessels, civilian transports, carrying construction workers, engineers, mining specialists, and their families. The humans were not just building a military presence, they were building a home. 6 months after the destruction of Outpost Caldera, I stood at the viewport of a human diplomatic station orbiting what they now called New Caldera, and I could not reconcile what I saw with what I remembered. The Mirith Corridor was unrecognizable. The Prometheus Anvil had spawned an industrial network that stretched across the system like a nervous system made of metal and light. 4 shipyard platforms operated in continuous production. 2 orbital habitats housed a growing civilian population that had already exceeded 8,000 and was projected to reach 30,000 within the year. A deep space communications relay linked the system to Earth's wider network. Mining operations spanned 3 asteroid belts, feeding a supply chain that could sustain construction for decades. A permanent fleet garrison of over 60 warships patrolled the system. Every one of them had been built here, from local materials, by the Anvil and its offspring. Not a single hull had been shipped from Earth. The Drathani sovereignty had been forced to the negotiating table. Our sector fleet was gone. Our territorial claims were meaningless. The system we had seized by destroying a small outpost now contained more human military and industrial power than the sovereignty could project across its entire frontier. I served as diplomatic liaison during the negotiations, a role I accepted because I understood something that my government's delegation did not, or would not. The humans were not interested in conquest. They were not interested in humiliation. Their terms were firm, but measured. Full withdrawal from the Mirith Corridor. Reparations for the 340 lives lost at Caldera. Recognition of human territorial claims throughout the contested region. A demilitarized buffer zone monitored by neutral parties. They did not demand Drathani territory. They did not call for regime change. They did not seek to break the sovereignty. They wanted the corridor, and they wanted a guarantee that we would never again mistake their willingness to build small for an inability to build large. The human admiral overseeing the corridor was a man named Philip Harding, a broad-shouldered figure with gray at his temples, and a voice that carried the quiet authority of someone who had never needed to raise it. He met with me privately during the second week of negotiations, in an office aboard the diplomatic station that overlooked the Anvil's ongoing construction operations. He poured me a drink, something amber and warm that I could not identify, and he told me something that restructured my understanding of the entire conflict. The Prometheus Anvil was not a unique response. It was not an improvisation or an escalation. It was standard doctrine. Earth maintained a strategic reserve of Forge-class shipyards specifically for this purpose. Whenever a human outpost was destroyed by hostile action, a shipyard was dispatched to the exact coordinates of the destroyed installation, not to rebuild what was lost, but to build something larger in its place. Every attack site became an industrial hub. Every act of destruction was treated as a site survey, proof that the location had strategic value worth defending at a scale the original outpost never represented. I set down my drink and stared at him. I asked how long this doctrine had been in effect. "Since the Kelvori incident," he said, and the name hit me like cold water because I knew the story, or thought I did. The Kelvori hegemony had struck a human colony on the Dresk frontier 8 years earlier. A small settlement, less than 2,000 people. The attack had been brutal, and the colony was destroyed. The Kelvori had celebrated their victory, declared the Dresk system purged of human presence, and moved on. I knew the Kelvori had subsequently retreated from the Dresk frontier. Intelligence reports attributed this to internal political instability, economic pressures, a change in strategic priorities. Admiral Harding told me the truth. A Forge-class shipyard had arrived at the Dresk system 4 weeks after the colony's destruction. Today, the system housed one of humanity's largest forward operating bases, with a permanent population of 200,000, a shipyard complex that supplied 3 neighboring sectors, and a fleet garrison that the Kelvori could not match with their entire combined navy. The Kelvori had not retreated from the Dresk frontier because of internal problems. They had retreated because they looked at what their attack had spawned and realized they could never undo it. I asked Admiral Harding how many other species had triggered this response. He gave me a number. It was larger than I expected. Then he told me something that made the number irrelevant. Every one of them attacked an outpost, he said. None of them did it twice. The negotiations concluded in the 4th week. The Drathani delegation signed the agreement in a ceremony that was broadcast across both civilizations. I watched my people's diplomats leave the station with rigid postures and tight faces, and I recognized their expression because I had worn it myself. It was the look of someone processing a fundamental reorientation of their understanding of power. They were not humiliated by defeat in battle. Defeat in battle was something the Drathani understood. It was painful, but comprehensible. You fought, you lost, you rebuilt and tried again. This was different. This was the realization that our great victory, the destruction of Outpost Caldera, the triumph that had earned me a promotion and filled our propaganda channels with celebration, was the single worst strategic decision in the history of the Drathani sovereignty. We had not wounded humanity. We had not exposed their weakness. We had given them a reason to move in permanently. I remained at New Caldera after the delegation departed. I had no desire to return to sovereignty space, where my name was now associated with the catastrophe I had helped create. The humans offered me a position as a permanent diplomatic liaison, a bridge between civilizations, and I accepted. In the months that followed, I walked through the corridors of New Caldera's growing habitats and watched a human city take shape in the void. Markets opened, schools were established. A medical center began treating patients from 6 different species, including Drathani civilians who had migrated to the corridor for trade opportunities that had not existed before the humans arrived. The Prometheus Anvil still operated at the heart of the system, but its output had shifted. Fewer warships now, more infrastructure. Communication relays, cargo transports, habitat modules, mining platforms. The machine of war had become a machine of civilization, and it did not distinguish between the two because, for humans, they were the same thing. I thought about this often. I thought about the error my species had made, and the errors that others had made before us. We looked at humanity's outposts and saw fragility. Small stations with thin walls and minimal weapons, crewed by soft beings who breathed a specific mixture of gases and required a narrow temperature range to survive. We measured their presence by what was visible and concluded that it was insignificant. We never looked beyond the outpost. We never asked what was behind it, what infrastructure and doctrine and industrial capacity existed beyond the horizon of our sensors. We saw the tip of the branch and thought we understood the tree. We never imagined the roots. The human approach to space was fundamentally different from ours, and from every other species I had studied. They did not expand by projecting military force outward from a defended core. They expanded by planting seeds, small installations in contested territory, lightly defended, apparently vulnerable. And when those seeds were destroyed, the destruction itself triggered the next phase of growth. It was not recklessness. It was not carelessness. It was a strategy so patient and so long-term that it looked like weakness to civilizations accustomed to measuring strength in the currency of immediate military power. Every outpost was a test. Can we build here without interference? If yes, the outpost grew slowly into a colony, and the colony into a settlement, and the settlement into a world. If no, if someone burned the outpost down, then the answer was even more useful. This location has strategic value. This location has hostile neighbors who will need to be deterred. This location requires a permanent, self-sustaining industrial presence that can defend itself and grow without depending on supply lines from Earth. The outpost was the question. The shipyard was the answer. On the day I completed my final report to the Drithani sovereignty, I stood at the viewport of the diplomatic station and watched a transport ship dock at Habitat 2. Its passenger manifest listed 412 humans, including 63 children. I watched them disembark through the transparent docking tube, small figures moving with the excited energy of people arriving somewhere new. The children pressed their faces against the viewports, staring at the asteroid belt where the Anvil's drones still worked, endlessly harvesting, endlessly building. One of the children pointed at a half-finished hull emerging from the Anvil's fabrication bay. Even from this distance, I could see her face light up with wonder. She was watching a ship being born, and to her, it was just a marvel. Just a spectacular thing happening outside her window. She did not know that the ship existed because of a war. She did not know that the station she was boarding had been built on the grave of another station. She did not know that the system her family now called home had been purchased with the wreckage of 2 fleets and the ambitions of a civilization that had mistaken silence for surrender. She was just a child, watching a ship being built, and she was smiling. I turned away from the viewport and opened my communication terminal. My report was addressed to Sovereign Malthrin and the full body of High Command. I knew they would read it, and I knew they would not listen, but I wrote it anyway. The report was 300 pages long. It contained tactical analyses, production data, fleet projections, economic impact assessments, and diplomatic recommendations. But the final paragraph was the only part that mattered, and I wrote it in the simplest language I could manage, because the truth was simple. Do not attack human outposts. Not because they will retaliate. They will do something far more dangerous than retaliate. They will improve. I sent the report and closed the terminal. Through the viewport, the Prometheus anvil turned slowly against the stars, its forges burning, its drones working, its bays building ships and homes and futures from the bones of the world that surrounded it. The humans had a saying I had learned during my time among them. I did not fully understand it when I first heard it, but I understood it now. They called it putting down roots. And once their roots were down, nothing in the galaxy had ever managed to pull them up again.